Hi everyone, my name's Anne Van Loon. I work for Baptist Care SA. Our church support team has put together this course, Be Care, to help individual Christians, small groups and churches to provide loving and compassionate care to one another so that you promote a sense of belonging in the community and well-being in the individuals and the community. The particular lesson that we're looking at today is how we can grow Be Care. And Be Care grows by following regulatory requirements. Not such an exciting topic, but an important topic, because when we follow the regulations that the law and laws of the land, we promote trust in our churches and in the care that we give to other people. So the particular things we're going to be looking at today are the need for accountability in all the ministries that we provide in health and pastoral care, how we provide professional behaviour in health and pastoral care ministry, and the legal and regulatory requirements for health and pastoral care ministry that we're obligated to live by. And as I said, these promote trust and respect from the community for the ministries that the church provides. So they're important things to consider. So for what are you accountable? That's each individual person. We are accountable for our professional and ethical standards as churches, how we function in the community, for the purpose of the ministry to which we are called, for upholding biblical principles in everything we do, for the procedures that we use when we are working with people, for the services that we offer, and the outcomes of those services, because there are many things that have been done with good intention over the years by churches and by other organisations and individuals, but the outcomes haven't been what people had hoped for. And in fact, we need to be very aware that we are responsible for the outcomes of everything that we do as part of church services, and for our professional conduct in the relationships that we have. Under no circumstances must we ever make our relationships unprofessional, and we'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. Privacy and confidentiality are really important. There are laws about that, and we need to make sure that things like prayer chains, confidentiality is maintained in small groups, that things that are said in the group stay in the group, and that we maintain people's privacy in everything. And you need to get authorization if you ever from the person if you ever want to pass on any information. And we're also responsible or accountable for the any resources of printed material or resources such as videos and things that we make. So to whom are we accountable? In Romans 14 verse 12 it says, each of us will give an account of ourselves to God. So we are always accountable to God first and last. We're accountable to ourselves for upholding our own biblical principles in the things we do. We are accountable to the person and the family to which they belong and any significant others in their lives. We are accountable to the faith community, both locally and denominationally, so things we do as a church will impact the denomination and Christians as a whole if we do the wrong thing. We are accountable as professionals. If you, for example, are a health professional, you are accountable to the various legislations and regulations of your health profession. We are accountable to the society via the law, via the regulations and acts such as the Child Protection Act, and we are also accountable via codes of ethics and conduct to the society. We are accountable to any employer that we have, whether we are a volunteer or salaried worker. We are still accountable to the employer to follow the rules that the employer sets. And if we have any funded program for anything, perhaps you're doing the community visitors scheme or something like that in your church, you're also accountable to the funder and responsible for the activities you do within that program. And as I said, we're always accountable to God in all of our actions as individuals, as communities, and as churches. So how are we accountable? And 2 Corinthians 6 verse 3 says, we put no stumbling block in anyone's path so that our ministry will not be discredited. It's really important that we do our best to maintain our systems of accountability so that people can have trust in the church. A lot of the credibility and trust in churches has been destroyed by the historical cases of child abuse within churches, and we really need to work hard at repairing and restoring that. So things like maintaining legal documentation that would stand up in a court of law, storage of any documents we have, that we maintain privacy of names, addresses and contact details, that any kind of data that we collect is privacy protected, for the quality assurance of any of the processes that we use, for our position descriptions that will hold us accountable. So if we've got position descriptions for volunteer roles, we can hold people accountable to those position descriptions. So it's really important to have those sorts of descriptions in there, because sometimes it's harder to get rid of a volunteer that's inappropriate than it is of a salaried person that's inappropriate. So having those position descriptions helps that process. And evaluating ministries and the performance of individuals regularly is important. It doesn't have to be an onerous thing. It can be a growth experience, and that can be done in ways that really help people to move forward and grow and develop in their ministry. And so ministry review and audit are all a part of how we maintain accountability. We need to evaluate our ministries regularly, and one of the things that we've discovered as church support team is that lots of really good things are being done by churches, but we can seldom use the data that they've of good news stories they have, but we've never got any data that we can work with to apply for any funding. So if you can keep statistics and evaluate your programs regularly and can say, look, we did X, Y, Z, and these were the results, it's so much easier to get external funding or to get support for programs that we do as organisations, and it will really help us to show that we're accountable in the way we use any funders' money. We need to make sure we maintain ministry budget lines of dollars in and out, because we are accountable to our church for good stewardship and responsible stewardship of the incomes. We're also responsible for continuing competence of our various leaders, so that it's important for our leaders to have time to read, to have time to go to in-service professional development and continuing journey seminars and things like that. We need to give people the opportunity to maintain and grow their knowledge and skills in their various ministry areas. And we need to make sure that we archive material so that we've got a historical account of the things that we've done as well. And then finally, one of the processes that we can use for personal accountability is confession and prayer to God, to make sure that we stay on the right track and are reflecting Him in our community. The second thing we need to look at is our professional behaviour, and we're aiming to keep within that central aspect, the therapeutic relation or the zone of helpfulness. This particular diagram comes from the Nursing and Midwifery Board's professional standards, and we expect people to stay within that middle therapeutic relationship. If you are over-involved, it's a boundary violation, and if you're under-involved, it's disinterest and neglect. And it's not that dissimilar in our health and pastoral care relationships. We need to stay in the zone of helpfulness. We're not allowed to get over-involved in people's struggles and problems, because that's a boundary violation. And we also need to not be under-involved, because if we don't care and we're disinterested, we're neglecting, and that's not a godly thing either. So ensure your relationships are appropriate and stay therapeutic. So there are several principles that we need to consider for professional behaviour. Upholding biblical principles and commandments in our interactions. Just recently we've had so many episodes of sexual misconduct within our greater community, within the Parliament of Australia, within the churches globally, and within big business. And it's up front and centre in the news all the time. We have to make sure that we continue with our biblical principles of respect and really maintaining good, safe conduct and protecting people. We have to uphold our duty of care and our professional integrity in all we do, so that we can't neglect people and ignore them. If people come forward with a complaint about somebody within our services, we have to respond. We can't just sweep it under the carpet and pretend it didn't happen, because that's not upholding our duty of care. We have a duty of care to protect people and for them to be safe. We have to be respectful and gracious and responsible, accountable and compassionate. And if we keep those 5 things foremost in mind when we're doing things, we will have really healthy ministries. Respect and being gracious and responsible, accountable and compassionate are just reflective of who Jesus is. We need to exercise faithful stewardship of both time, treasure and talent, so that we don't overuse any people and we don't underuse people, and we are accountable for all of our finances as well. We need to really manage power differentials in relationships, and this is especially important with children and with any kind of vulnerable person. When you come in a caring capacity, whatever that may be, there's a power differential immediately when you're working with vulnerable people, and you need to make sure that you take that into consideration when you're working with them. And there's a lot more that can be said on that, but not in this introductory video. We need to recognise and avoid any conflict of interest. If you all have a specific project or program that you're involved with, manage the conflict of interest if you're working across a variety of different relationships, so that you can't be, say there's a relationship breakdown, you can't be representing both parties in the relationship breakdown because there's a conflict of interest there. You can for a period of time while you're trying to mediate, but you then need to represent neither of the parties. If you're representing one party or another, make sure that you that each of those parties knows that. Really important to recognise when the conflict of interest is coming and how to avoid it, and that's also a topic which we can go into more at a later stage. And you need to maintain objectivity in all your relationships, because you can get very close to people, and if they say things that are hurtful, you can take that quite personally, and it shouldn't be taken personally. It needs to be taken at a professional level where out of conflict can sometimes come the best growth and the strongest relationships. Not something to be avoided, but something to be managed, and managed very carefully and lovingly. Take great care when using all media, especially social media. You may not print anything on social media, and you can't post those photographs without permission. And so you should have in your camp forms that people sign to go to camp, permission forms, permission to take photographs as well, particularly if they're of minors. So be very careful about what you post on social media, because it's there permanently, and people can, if they haven't given permission, can say that their privacy has been broken. We need to maintain privacy and confidentiality, but that isn't different to secrecy around abuse. When abuse is occurring, it is not secret. It may damage the reputation of the church, but if it's not dealt with, it will damage the reputation of way more than the church at this time. You need to make sure that if there is any abuse, that there's no secrecy and that the law is followed. You need to get informed consent written, if possible, before sharing any personal information of the person, and make sure that the person has the capacity to consent. If they're a minor, they don't have the capacity to give legal consent. Be careful when you nurture relationships with people. Just maintain care that you keep those boundaries, which we've spoken about earlier, legitimate. Avoid any form of sexual misconduct. It seems to be stating the patently obvious, but it also seems to be something that is a trap for humanity since the beginning of time, and we need to be very aware that any form of sexual interaction is misconduct and not professional and possibly illegal. You need to treat all people with respect, fairness and courtesy, and we always need to operate from biblical values and principles in good faith. I know that seems like a lot to cover at this time in such a short way, but all we're hoping to do at this time is introduce it. We can go into greater depth at other times in different courses. But you need to ask yourself, what is my role in this situation? Am I sharing information to benefit the person? Are my emotions clouding the issue with this person? Are other person's emotions clouding the issue with me? And if in doubt, don't follow through. And I leave you with Proverbs 16 verse 16. How much better to get wisdom than gold, to get insight rather than silver. Remember, God promises to give us wisdom, and he will give it to us if we ask it. But you need to ask yourself some of those questions when you are if your conduct is in question. We don't want, these are the kinds of offences that can occur. Assault, battery, false imprisonment, loss of consortium just means that perhaps someone in your church has had an affair with someone else and that's impacted their marriage. That's loss of consortium the person can sue for. Defamation of character, if something came out and someone said something abusive at a meeting or something like that. Emotional distress. Intentional indifference, if people are not being heard or cared for. Breach of confidentiality and invasion of privacy. These are all things that can damage people, and the law gives those people entitlement to get recompense. If you have got health practitioners such as faith community nurses or any other form of health practitioner involved in your health aspects of your pastoral care, there is a health practitioner regulation law that was passed in 2010, and that governs all of health practitioners, even in a voluntary role. And you just need to be aware that just because you're not being paid doesn't mean you're exempt from the law. If you're working in your health practitioner capacity, the law stays, and even if you're a volunteer. Just a little bit more on the privacy and confidentiality. In 1988, the Privacy Act came into being, and it means that we have to get informed, documented consent before we disclose information. We have to be responsible that if we're doing any kind of counselling or conversations about, deeply personal things such as can happen sometimes when we're praying for one another, that those are private and confidential discussions. They're not spoken about to other people, and they're done in a way where they can't be overheard. If there's any kind of record, only people that access those records are those that are authorised to do so. They're not put on any kind of electronic platform for other people to see. We need to be very sure that we don't transmit, share or post any person's information or images via social media, online, or even if the person is not directly named or identified, without their written informed consent. So for example, if I take a photo of a group of us doing an activity at a women's ministry meeting, if I haven't got permission from those other 4 or 5 people on that photograph, I can't post that photograph. And it's important that we realise that, because there's a lot of it happening in social media, and we don't know if at any given time someone will say, oh, actually, I don't want to be associated with that group of people anymore because I'm angry with them, and they can still have a right to say their privacy was invaded because they didn't give informed consent. So make sure you understand your obligations with privacy and confidentiality. And if you are a health practitioner and working in the pastoral care ministry, you must maintain records, and that's something we can talk about another time. Remember, we all have obligations as health workers in particular for mandatory reporting, and that can include child abuse and neglect if we know and see it's happening. It can include infectious diseases, impairment of any kind of health practitioner. So if you've got someone working in your team who is a health practitioner and they're working outside of their scope of practice and you're not comfortable with it, that needs to be reported. Intoxication while practicing, significant departure from professional standards that are acceptable, and any form of sexual misconduct. Now the pictures there is like you can guard yourself against all kinds of chemical exposure with suits and breathing masks and helmets and gloves and the whole bit, but we can't protect ourselves against social problems without doing the things that are required for responsible, accountable, professional ministry. And it needs to follow the law at all times. We need to be very aware of the person's rights, particularly in several different areas, but the area of mental health, if someone becomes violent or aggressive, we need to be aware that restraint is not permitted and it can be taken as false imprisonment. We are better off ringing up medical help or police help than restraining the person ourselves. Now, I know of cases where in a church that people were held down because they were praying for someone who had demonic possession, and that person sued very successfully the church and all the individuals that were involved for restraint and false imprisonment. And it has created great sadness in that community and to those individuals involved, because they have all been now got criminal records over something that was a part of their ministry. So be very aware that people cannot be restrained or falsely imprisoned in any way. There's the rights of people around palliative care you need to be aware of in this ministry, privacy and confidentiality, which we've already spoken about. The rights of people who are frail, the aged and the disabled have rights, and in any form of ministry we need to be aware of those. Just being a volunteer or in a ministry doesn't make you exempt from understanding the law and the rights that people have. Volunteers also have rights, and they have the right to refuse to do things. So in ministry as well, if a volunteer doesn't want to do something, you can't coerce anybody to do anything. And then, of course, the rights that everyone has for a safe work environment, and a church is a safe work environment, so work health and safety rules and regulations. And I know this all sounds like, oh, why would we do ministry? But you know what? We can easily uphold all these things if we do the right thing. People have nothing to hold us against us. So it's so important that we reflect to the community that we will do what the law says. If you're a health practitioner, just to be aware that you must have professional indemnity insurance. It's legally mandated in Australia, and churches have to carry that insurance as well, and it will usually cover most voluntary roles. But if you're going in as a health practitioner, you should check and ensure that the professional indemnity of your church is covering the activities that you are doing in your ministry. Get approval from the insurer in writing before commencing, and as I said, it's the law to carry professional indemnity insurance if you're a health practitioner, so be aware of that. Now, don't be alarmed. Act with wisdom and love. Really, we have to talk about it because it's an important part of who we are as churches, to be law-abiding, but it isn't anything that's too onerous. If you work through those things early in the piece, you'll get really viable, good, thriving ministries. In James 1 verse 5 it says, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given to him. We can ask for wisdom and we will get it, so we will know what's the right thing to do. And then in Romans 13 verse 8, owe no one anything except to love each other, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. It's God's law that we love each other, and if we work with wisdom and love, we will find that most of these legal, professional and accountability issues are very manageable. Now, the learning activity I've given you is to have a look at the table in your handout and consider your church's response and your personal response to some of the legal requirements that govern the church's ministry. Just have a think about each of those issues. There's many more than the ones that are documented there, but have a think about those and how your church is responding as far as you know, and how you would respond in your ministry, so that you just grow your own awareness. And God bless you. I know it's a difficult topic, but an important one.